Hi, welcome back to Rebel Movement Podcast. My name is Billie. My pronouns are they, them, or she, her, and I'm really glad you're here. We have another awesome conversation today, and this interview is amazing. It's like an amazing conversation and a whole series of amazing conversations. I don't know if you've missed them lately, but you should go back and listen to all of the episodes lately, honestly. I like all the episodes, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't put them out there, but just these conversations have been so amazing. So here is another one for you. Before we get there, a couple of things. First thing is thank you to Elise for doing the captions or the transcript. I usually thank you at the end. I'm going to thank you at the beginning here because it's made a really big difference for me. Um, Also feels really cool as a small business um, to have an employee. And that's pretty badass. Plus, an employee who is also a super cool person. Elise does a lot of really cool art, and I just super appreciate her. And then second thing is if you want to support me and my podcast, the work that I do, I put out newsletters every week. If you're not already on that, you should go to the captions or the show notes. And click to get my newsletter. I put out newsletters once a week, sometimes twice a week. You get a little bit more when you first sign up because as a part of signing up for my newsletter, you get a whole bunch of free stuff like free yoga classes, free recordings, free mobility, I think, or breath work. There's a whole bunch of free stuff. Um, and if you sign up for that, you get that. Also, if you're in my newsletter, you get discounts. You kind of get to know me a little bit better. Um, and I talk a lot about anti-diet movement, trauma-informed movement, mental health awareness, all that kind of stuff. So if you like to know the more personal stuff about me, that's a place to go. Um, what was the other thing I was saying? Oh yeah, if you want to support me in the work I do, that's one way of doing it is subscribe to my newsletter. And then if you like the stuff I do and the stuff I'm offering, I do virtual one-on-one coaching, like life coaching and movement coaching. And I also do a virtual it's like a virtual yoga studio, virtual workout studio. There's classes every single week as a part of that. But if neither of those options appeal to you, you can also go to buy me a coffee or basically give me a tip. If you use the link in the show notes, it should say buy me a coffee. It'll bring you over to I think it's called Ko-fi page, Ko-fi. And for as little as $3 Canadian, you can either tip me once or you can set up to tip me once a month. If you really like the stuff I'm doing, I would love to be able to afford to continue doing this work. Um, any of you business owners know a lot of the work that I do is not paid. Including the podcast is not stopping me though, because I absolutely love the podcast and all of these are really fantastic conversations. Yeah, so thank you for supporting me. Thank you for all of your support. I'm just super appreciative of you, and it still feels a little bit odd to ask for support in such a bold way. We've had a bit of conversations about this before. Um, so this is me practicing. Support me. Um, but I'll let you get to the episode because this is a absolutely fantastic episode. Thanks. Hey, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you and your time being here. Can you tell us your name, your pronouns, and a little bit about you?
Yeah, so my name is Sneha. I use she, her pronouns, and I teach yoga, breathwork, and meditation currently based in Peterborough, Ontario. I love making yoga more accessible for folks, helping folks relax and get into their bodies. And I love also providing kind of like custom tailored yoga to clients. And so that's kind of what I'm all about. Outside of yoga, I'm also a writer and an activist. And yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Very cool. What kind of writer?
Mhm. I write poetry mostly.
Nice. That's
Yeah.
very cool. That's awesome. You're
hmm
not too far away from where I am. I mean, like a bit of a
hmm
trek, but a little closer than I think a lot of my guests so far lately have been like in the States down somewhere. So that's kind of cool that we're so close. I guess not all of them, but anyway, that's not why we're here. I just find
hmm
it interesting because I don't think I realized you were that close. I'm just
That's
in
all
Prince Edward
good.
County, so not too far. What
Nice.
yeah. I just moved here. I used to live in Kingston and
Yeah.
so even further away, but um there's so many cool things that I want to talk about with you, and I'm not really sure where to start. I
Hmm.
guess I could ask, like, what's your
Hmm.
I love the reasons you teach yoga, by the way. I love that. I love like all of the
Thank
reasons
you.
and specifically tailoring yoga
Hmm.
to specific people. I love that too. It's so um I don't know. I don't even know how to explain it. It's just so interesting and fulfilling and just
Hmm.
a really nice way of like connecting with people.
For
Um,
sure.
what is your history with yoga like? Like what got you teaching? What got you practicing?
Hmm. Yeah, so I was actually born in India, and the first time I like to say I've been kind of practicing since the womb because my mom took a prenatal class when she was pregnant
Aw,
with me.
cute.
Um, but yeah, so it's been a big part of like my cultural upbringing. I actually, when I was 3, my grandfather and I used to sit in front of the TV way back in India and do Baba Ramdev's like TV specials in the mornings. And so we'd be
Hmm.
like practicing butterfly pose and things like that. So I've kind of been practicing for a long time. I reconnected with yoga actually really randomly because I was taking a French class and my French teacher was really into yoga. This was like, you know how in Ontario you take French all throughout school.
Oh,
So
yeah, yeah.
um, yeah, so that was really odd that I reconnected it through it. Uh, just in grade 7 in my class, we'd like go outside and do yoga in the afternoons, and kind of practice like body vocabulary that way. But I just found it was such a grounding practice. And at that point in time, I was feeling really called to my spiritual journey. Somehow at the age of 12, I had like recently moved to Canada. And I think I've always been like a very reflective and introspective person. And so having that practice to kind of ground into my body, I just really connected with it. And so I took classes on and off for years. And then during COVID, I think was when I really started to hone into practicing daily. And I always knew I wanted to do my yoga teacher training. And I always knew I wanted to go back to India to do it, kind of learn from the roots,
Hmm.
and honor that ancestral wisdom. And so after I graduated university, yeah, so I was just saying that I got my 200-hour training in Rishikesh, which is, I guess, kind of known as the birthplace of yoga, although I feel like it's hard to pinpoint a birthplace in a practice that's thousands of years old.
Hmm.
And the spiritual community there was just outstanding. I felt like it was so cool to be in a space where, like, in the neighborhood of Upper Tapovan in Rishikesh, it's like all yoga centers and students. And so a lot of people who were spiritually and were have their PhDs in yoga, which I didn't even know you get a yoga until I went there.
Yeah,
Um, and so just learning from people who had that kind of yeah, strong ancestral ties who had really dedicated their life to this was a really special experience. And after that, I really did in my daily practice and wanting to kind of share it with others. So, yeah, that's how I started. I yeah, actually started out teaching just like family and friends. I would teach like some aunties in Peterborough where I live, like my mom's friends, and that was really cool to get to share the practice with people who are from the same cultural background.
hmm.
And kind of teaching at the hospital, like I said, with patients, working on pairing with nonprofits, like just make yoga more accessible to communities that need it most and need that ability to relax and reconnect with their bodies and minds. So, yeah,
That's awesome. Thank you.
hope that answers your question. I feel like that was like a big
No,
overview.
it was a great answer. It definitely answers it. I like it. I liked hearing the whole story. I really like hearing where folks like why folks do the things they do because I find that as always so interesting. One of the things that we had talked about, I guess now because we had to do a little break for a second. um
That's all
it
good.
feels less like of a segue. But we talked about
That's okay. No worries.
talking about that seems like a weird sentence. We talked about talking about your experience as a BIPOC person and a queer person, and as a teacher, and I think as a person, and making yoga and wellness more inclusive. And I, how would it feel like? How would you like to start this conversation? What would feel comfortable for you? And like, I know we heard about your bit about your story. I know sometimes these kinds of things can be a little bit
Mhm.
like feel a little bit one-sided because like I'm just asking you all these questions about your life and yourself. So
No, that's all
what would feel good
good.
for you?
Yeah, we can, I guess, start off by talking a little bit. I guess like parts of my story that I could expand on was that I think reconnecting with yoga, like growing up in Peterborough, was something that was a bit challenging for me because I felt like a deep connection to the practice, but I didn't have a lot of like Indian community around me or BIPOC community around me in the spaces that
Hmm.
I was in. Um, there's a lot of times when like as someone who's in practice, so people would ask me like about Hindu mythology or different terminology and things like that, and I was like, this isn't necessarily you know appropriate because I'm like coming
Yeah.
into the space to kind of learn. And I wish I had that like strong knowledge base, but as someone who left India when I was 5, and obviously, grew up in a small town in Ontario that was like mostly white, um, was something that I've kind of had to learn to be okay with in order to engage with the practice at some of the like local studios and in the local culture. And there was also like I guess I grew up, in a Hindu family, and so a lot of the terms that are used in yogic spaces traditionally, like namaste or the Om mantra or even the symbol Om, like kind of to see people use that and maybe not necessarily understand the fundamentals of it was something that never quite sat right with me.
Hmm.
Um, and even like there was a local yoga festival where they would do like kirtans and they'd be singing these kind of like devotional Hindu songs. And I remember just being kind of weirded out. I was like volunteering at this yoga festival when I was 19 and being like, this is so cool that there's this space where people can engage in the practice together. And I'm glad that like so many people around the world feel connected to yoga nowadays. But I'm glad that there's now like I think more conversations happening about appropriation and about how to kind of respect the lineage more. Because I think that's really important. And I think growing up, that's something that like I wish I had more spaces to practice in as someone who's a member of like the South Asian diaspora in Canada.
Hmm.
Um, really get a lot of opportunities to be able to really be liberated through the practice, which I think for me is really the ultimate goal of yoga, is that kind of like spiritual connection and liberation. And it's kind of like, you know, I think like it's great that there's so many people who are using these tools, but I just wonder how are they honoring the lineage? What are their goals and intentions?
Hmm.
Um, and so I'm glad that those conversations are happening more in the yoga community. I think I definitely have to shout out, the work of folks like Tejal Yoga and Susanna Barkataki, who have really spoken out about this, Anjali Rao. I think it's amazing to see that conversation happening kind of on an international level. And I also think that I've seen a lot of change even just locally. So I was, you know, away for university and traveling for a few years and then moved back to Peterborough this year. Um, in January, and I've definitely noticed a difference in the way yoga is approached by certain studios and by the community as a whole, and kind of an appreciation for honoring the tradition. So I'm hoping to see that momentum continue.
Yeah, of course. Um, what kind of what kind of changes did you see? Is it okay if I ask that? You
Yeah,
don't
for
have to
sure.
out
So I
specific
see.
studios. Sorry.
No, that's all good. No worries. I think it's cool that a lot of studios offer like yoga philosophy courses.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that there's definitely still a lot of like, you know, white fitness dominance in yoga. But I think that like I see the incorporation of practices like pranayama and breath work into classes more. And I also see people approaching yoga with more curiosity and openness and less kind of prescriptiveness about how they're using certain terms, how they're incorporating certain movements. Um, so I think that that's been uplifting to see for sure. I hope that answers
Hmm.
your question.
Yeah, it totally does. I was worried when I first asked it that it would come out like I'm asking you to out specific studios or something, and I didn't want to put you in that kind of position. Totally
No, no,
answered my
that's all
question.
good.
Yeah. Um, Oh, I had another question. I forgot what it was.
Okay.
Um, I have, it's okay if you don't know the answer to this question also, or maybe more so your opinion.
Hmm.
Um, Actually, no, sorry, I just remembered my other question.
That's okay. No worries.
At the beginning, you were just talking about how you would go to studios and folks were um, asking you about some of the philosophy of yoga, and it cut out a little bit. Were you like going into these studios as a student when they were asking you
Hmm.
this? Oh, just asking you and assuming you would know.
Yeah, exactly.
That yeah.
So I think that was kind of, just this assumption of like, um, I think that that's like something I think about a lot as someone who's done a lot of anti-racist and anti-oppressive work. That one of the methods of othering is assuming that there's uniformity within any kind of minority group, like assuming that anyone from India would have the answers to these questions, would have this kind of connection to their culture and religion and lineage. Um, and I think that I don't think that's the fault of any specific individual, who's coming to me with that kind of curiosity. And I also think, Western media has such a large role to play in this, in the sense that um, there's only certain parts of Indian culture that are, known to people. And so I don't think that it's like, again, the fault of any individual. I think a lot of it is like, racism, systemic racism, um, and kind of also how people might not have those other resources to reach out to, or might not know what else is out there. But again, I think with social media and the internet now, and how much work is being done by folks specifically on combating the appropriation of yoga, and also on kind of like, anti-racist work more broadly. I think that there's so many resources out there that I would hope that people who are teaching yoga or coming into the practice are kind of doing their homework a little bit, to make sure that they're, honoring that cultural lineage. And also just kind of knowing, again, the intention behind the practice. Because I think when yoga is viewed as fitness, or is viewed as like posture focused, and I know you've spoken a lot about this as well, it kind of takes away from the spiritual origins of the practice. And maybe not everyone who's coming into a yoga studio is looking for that kind of spiritual ties. But I think just at least coming into the practice, knowing that there is that history is like kind of a bare minimum.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It is a bare minimum. When I took my teacher training, and I'm not going to say anything about where or who,
Hmm.
um, there was a yoga philosophy component of it, but
Hmm.
not to the extent that it was ever explained to me why, um, like what namaste, like there was a definition or sort of a vague translation that was probably similar to most Western yoga studios, but
Hmm.
the studio I was at didn't use a lot of like Om mantras
Hmm.
often. Some
Hmm.
teachers would, but there definitely was like a culture of a lot of um, kirtans or that kind of thing, but not a lot of explanation as to why we're saying these things or where they came from. And I did my training like years, I don't even know, 7 or 8 years ago. So I'm
Hmm.
glad that I have seen much more about cultural appropriation, and I'm hoping that more teacher trainings have, I think they should have whole sections, whole
Hmm.
lectures on a lot of this, because it is, like you said, it's a part of where it came from, and it just seems like something that needs to be a part of the any kind of trainings. um
Hmm.
I'm interested in your opinion, if you don't mind.
Hmm.
Um, I've seen a couple of schools of thought of some folks will still use Namaste and still use Om mantras and kirtans, who maybe they're a little bit more um, versed in the history and the yoga philosophy, and the
Hmm.
culture behind it. And then there are some schools of thought where you don't say namaste, you don't do some of those things. And just curious of your thoughts on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that
Oops.
question. I would say that I think if you're honoring the spiritual history and you are aware of that and you're kind of approaching how you use those terms, how you're engaging those practices, in a manner that is respectful, I think that, you know, these are tools for spiritual liberation, tools for connection with the spirit and the soul. That like my take on it is if those tools help you, then I feel like that's probably what the ancestors would have wanted in the first place, you know, for people to find healing and community and liberation through them.
Hmm.
Um, what I will say, like with kirtan specifically, is I think that there's a lot of like, you know, Hindu religious sites like temples, and kind of other like kind of Indian community, or South Asian community that's leads some of those practices, like even where I live in Peterborough. And so I feel like it would be, you know, perhaps a bit more generative, if folks
Hmm.
want to attend those kirtans that are hosted by the community as opposed to hosting their own. Um, and I also think for me, when it comes to appropriation, like it really does come down to like also just how are you centering the voices of the people whose tradition you're kind of using, you know?
Hmm.
And also just kind of also redirecting like profit in a way, you know? Um,
Absolutely.
like, are you donating in order to support the work of ancestral knowledge holders? You know, and are you kind of like approaching these practices in a way that's helping your quote unquote like business model or your profit motives, you know?
Hmm.
That's I think where it really gets a bit tricky for me. So because I personally feel like um you know, because there's sort of these blurred lines between like, you know, the Hindu religion and yoga as a spiritual practice that's closely tied to the religion, I think that there needs to be some sensitivity around like, you know, honoring that there are people out there who are doing that work in a religious context, and that that's like meant to be free for everyone to access, you know?
Hmm.
Um, as opposed to kind of having those closed off spaces where you're creating spiritual community and potentially profiting off of like a tradition that's not necessarily yours, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Um, is there it's not like so far my understanding, um, just from the things you've said, is one of the main things that yoga teachers and studios can do to minimize or reduce cultural appropriation is to make sure that the component of um like the yoga philosophy and understanding, like you're saying, the close ties to Hindu
Mhm.
religion, sorry, as well as, of course, as you just said, donate like sending money back to
Mhm.
those ancestral cultural places. Are there other
Mhm.
things that folks can do either as students or teachers or studios to reduce cultural appropriation, sorry?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a really important question. And I definitely think that I have just one voice on this. I think there's a lot of folks out there who are, you know, kind of approaching this in their own communities. And
For
I think
sure.
that's like really starts at the grassroots level. But just to give you my kind of opinion on this, I think people who are practicing yoga definitely, again, just taking some time to do your reading. You know, there's a great book called Embody Yoga's Roots by Susanna Barkataki that really talks about, um, you know, the history of yoga and how to respect it in your practice. And just understanding your own goals going into it. That, you know, this was historically a practice for spiritual liberation, for connecting the mind, body, and the spirit, for achieving enlightenment potentially, and just kind of recognizing and honoring that history in your own practice. And I think for studios, I think definitely, you know, taking that time to offer yoga philosophy courses, to also kind of provide explanations in terms of how you're cueing, about things like how the breath is used in yoga, about how breath work is tied to yogic practice. Um, and also how, yoga is so much broader than just the like postures or asanas that we see in most traditional studios. That it's, also again, like there's meditation components, there's karma yoga, which is all focused on like good actions. There's so many different limbs of yoga. So I think a lot of it really is just taking the time to do your own reading on the philosophy and the history, and just approaching the way you structure classes in a way that, you know, makes sure that students are, like, people coming into the space are cognizant of that history. One thing I do is I even like do a land acknowledgement before I start any classes, and this is, I guess, a practice that's pretty common across Turtle Island, from what I've seen, in terms of, just acknowledging the traditional, whose traditional land you're on before the start of any gathering. But also before my classes, I also acknowledge that, yoga is a tradition that has a complicated colonial history. And that, like, as an Indian instructor, I try and kind of honor the cultural roots. So even just starting off the space with a recognition of that, I think can be really powerful. Um, and yeah, I think a lot of it just, like I said, comes down to honoring that philosophy throughout your classes, and throughout the way that you are kind of what you're offering at your studio as well. Hmm.
Thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to share that. Sorry, I had to cough right at the end of you talking, so I hope I got that out. And right before I smacked my
Okay.
microphone really hard, so hopefully all of those are not in the are not in the recording at all.
I didn't hear
Um,
anything. You know what? It's all
oh,
about what
perfect.
makes it more little homemade kind of production, you know?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Not going to perfection here.
That's very true. That's very true.
Mhm.
Um, I really appreciate everything you just shared. I really liked that the suggestion of adding in the acknowledgement of the history of yoga to land acknowledgements. Um,
Mhm.
it's that's a very good idea, and it's one that is easy enough to add in, I think.
Mhm.
Not that the other things shouldn't be done. I just mean like that seems like a very um good stepping stone for anyone who's wondering about how to make their practice or their space more inclusive. Um,
Mhm.
I, how do I word this? Just for folks who are listening, there can be this, um, you let me know,
Mhm.
your opinion on this. It's just when some of this was still being talked about a little bit more at the beginning of it, you know what I mean? It was like, what was it?
Mhm.
Number and sometime in the pandemic, it was started to be talked about a lot more. I mean, at least from what I saw, um,
Mhm.
around cultural appropriation and specifically
Mhm.
cultural appropriation in yoga. And one thing
Mhm.
that I witnessed, um, as a white person in some primarily white spaces, um,
Mhm.
is this um, I don't have like ego would come up is
Yeah.
a very direct way of saying it that
Mhm.
um, some folks would have thoughts like, oh, they other people have to give us feedback, otherwise we can just assume we're not doing anything wrong. Or
Mhm.
if someone gives us feedback that we might be doing something harmful, of like instinctively going to defend yourself. And I just feel like
Yeah.
a big part of this work, in any kind of social justice work, I think, is really
Mhm.
learning how to take feedback or
Yeah.
just listening without it being um, about being defensive. Because I do want to say that it's okay if if you have feelings come up, but
Mhm.
in whatever these conversations, because they will. But
Yeah.
if someone's coming to you and saying, hey, this is how this you're teaching this is coming off as cultural appropriation or harmful for any other reason, um, the main thing to do in that conversation is to listen and hold space for them. Your feelings, you can have them with other like by yourself with other folks, it is not the person giving you feedback's job to fix your feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one thing that I've witnessed um, a little too many times
Mm-hmm.
in the community around me for a bit, that that's a really important part. And it's the conversation around intention versus impact also is important, that like your intention isn't more important than the impact that you have.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I I was definitely a teacher when I first started. I said namaste. I don't think I went to a couple um events that were a little bit more um I don't know if they were called kirtans. I think I'm saying that word wrong. Um
It's like pronounced kirtan, but it's a sound that
kirtan.
doesn't really exist in English, like the
Okay.
soft T, like kirtan.
Tan.
So it can be a
Okay.
little tricky. Yeah,
Thank you.
of
Kirtan.
course. Mm-hmm.
Um and then somewhere around, probably around this time, when this time, this is not very specific. I don't mean right now. I mean back when a few years
Mm-hmm.
ago when there was more conversation around cultural appropriation. I read I can think it was an article about, I've so long ago, I have no idea where it is. I wish I had it still, but it's an article
Mm-hmm.
around with someone who was from India, and they were explaining their opinion or their feelings and their opinion, their history. And in it, they said that when they came to Western yoga studios and they heard people saying namaste at the end of classes, it felt like quite painful for them. It felt harmful.
Mm-hmm.
And there was definitely, I stopped using it in my classes then because I didn't know beforehand. I'm glad that I learned, but there was, and I just felt, not that I'm saying this is how, I'm not trying to say this is like this is the right opinion versus what you said shared earlier at all.
Mm-hmm.
Just
Mm-hmm.
that it's something that when I started to do, a lot of the white folks in my classes kind of got
Mm-hmm.
upset, which I found to be a little bit outrageous,
Mm-hmm.
especially given the conversations being had then. But just, I
Yeah.
guess, this is more geared for white folks.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean this in a very like loving way, but sometimes in a lot of this work, especially if you're at the beginning of social justice work, it can be really easy to get like stuck in your head about right and wrong and get in your own way a
Mm-hmm.
little bit for these conversations. One of
Yeah.
the biggest things in my journey, which is not the, example journey by any means, but is just to learn to listen
Yeah,
and
totally.
learn that way. Yeah, sorry I feel like I just rambled for a long time, but
No, that was, yeah, it's so helpful. I think it's really important to recognize that this work is uncomfortable for a lot of people, that there are a lot of big feelings, and a lot of uncertainty, you know? I don't think any one person can really say like what is appropriate or not. I think again, that's why I said like I feel like it really comes back down to like that working on the grassroots and community level, like knowing if you're a teacher who's coming into your spaces, if you're a student, what your values are with this, and just being ready to be a little bit uncomfortable in these conversations, like you said. I think that's so important. Um, and I think when we talk about like yoga spiritual lineage, the kind of dissolution of the ego, is something that's talked about a lot, in
Mhm.
yogic scripture. And so I think, if you're engaging in this practice, then maybe it's worth considering, what your spiritual connection to it is, and also learning how to step away from that need to defend yourself, step away from that need to be right. And like you said, just kind of making space for learning and growth, and recognizing that, maybe it's that I, right? Like that notion of I, that notion of me, that kind of gets in the way sometimes when we are all so inherently connected. And I always come back to this in my activism, that like our liberation is tied together. And in a lot of ways, so is our wrongdoing, you know? I think
Mm-hmm.
that especially in the West, like we live in these individualist societies where we're often tempted to consider one like there's a lot of like cancel culture going on, of like um considering an individual person's actions, the way an individual person approaches their practice. But that's like for me, I'm always like that's just informed by these broader narratives, of like appropriation and also the broader history of yoga. I mean, I think again nowadays there's a lot of conversations about um, like Indian yogis who came to North America and spread this practice in a way that wasn't really authentic to its roots, and also, were very violent towards students at times. Like I don't know if you've seen the Bikram yoga documentary on Netflix,
Oh
or
yeah.
kind of the things that come out about Yogi Bhajan, who was the founder of Kundalini yoga. Um, so I think it's important to recognize that like white people also aren't always to blame in this, like the way that yoga was transmuted to the West was, I don't think there was a lot of intention or foresight of it becoming this like large scale kind of practice. And I also honestly like don't really personally think that some of those folks who were spreading yoga to the West in the 1900s were really like honoring the roots of the practice themselves in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think that we have to recognize that all these conversations about appropriation are taking place in kind of this broader, um, collective, perhaps erasure of the history, and also about that, like, we need to recognize that as a community who's practicing yoga, and by that I mean anyone who's ever practiced or taught, um, that we need to work on these things together and have these difficult conversations together, as opposed to kind of dividing into, different camps and just um sorry, I lost my train of thought there, but just kind of like recognizing that it's not the individual that's kind of doing the harm. You know what I mean? Like it's like these conversations need to happen at a systemic level, and it's not just the individual teacher who's wrong for doing those things. It's a collective thing that we all need to unlearn.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point. Um, this I've thought a lot about cancel culture and the like calling in versus calling out. I don't know where that phrase came from. I wish I did not come up with it. Just want to put that out there. I can't credit who did because I completely just lost it, but it's a
Mm-hmm.
conversation I've had with a couple of friends and a couple of other people in different communities. And for myself in these conversations, it's often um, with like queer inclusivity and trauma inclusivity,
Mm-hmm.
things like that, that um, there's a way to have a conversation with someone who has a different opinion than you without it being about canceling them or without
Mm-hmm.
it being like a while ago, I can't, a couple months ago, posted a video just like on Instagram, just with my name and pronouns, shared that I was non-binary, they, them pronouns, or she, her, but that they,
Mm-hmm.
them feels nice, like feels really nice. And
Mm-hmm.
the comments were just like a lot of them were very bullying centered, and it
Mm-hmm.
I just the bunch of different things happening in my life anyway. Just this idea that you can't that there's a skill of being able to have a conversation with someone who has a different opinion than you without it being about
Mm-hmm.
canceling them or bullying them. And it's
Mm-hmm.
I guess also just kind of comes back to being able to listen and
Mm-hmm.
um in some cases, depending on the topic, recognizing that you might just have different opinions and that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're talking about social justice issues, that like in this example, someone's pronouns are none of your business. Like you didn't decide that, you don't decide that, it's not your business. Like
Yeah.
deal with your shit somewhere else. And then
Mm-hmm.
also as like to the like tying this to the conversation we're having, that like you
Mm-hmm.
said, recognizing that there's an issue with the system, like the systemic issue that has to do with how it's taught, how maybe this particular yoga teacher was taught yoga, maybe they weren't taught certain things, and that
Mm-hmm.
in order to grow and heal up more as a community, the education component should be there. Also, with a little asterisk that it is not up to white people to decide what is and what is not cultural appropriation. That the voices, like in all of these areas, the voices should be centered, that are centered should be the voices who are in that particular community.
I wanted to again start off just by saying that I'm like holding space for what you shared about your experience. I'm grateful that you shared that with me, in terms of, you know, having people have a negative response to you sharing your identity and your pronouns. I'm so sorry that you went through that. And also, I know like apologizing obviously doesn't make it any easier, but yeah, I'm grateful that you shared your perspective in terms of, um, yeah, like knowing that white fragility is a thing, and that a lot of times people feel self-righteous in their opinions, um, because you know they want potentially they have some hurt that they want to project their versions of what you should be like, how you should be acting, you know, based on the way that they've been indoctrinated into like broader systems of maybe gender, race, or identity. And I think what's so interesting about the queer community and also about like the racialized communities, like just I guess like the minority communities that are like claiming their voices and speaking out in those ways and claiming their identities, um, is just that we are actively like not only healing within by doing that unlearning, by coming to accept ourselves, but we're also challenging those broader notions for people in a way, you know? Like for me also to say that I'm non-binary, I think that a lot of times people are maybe confused by that, or people don't really know how to act around that, you know? And so again, I think it comes back to just like being willing to understand that the kinds of movements that we're having in social justice, are going to require people to be uncomfortable and to, yeah, dissolve that notion of ego and self-righteousness and just kind of dissolve, also like sort of these broader kind of ways that we've been indoctrinated by patriarchy, by capitalism, into the ways that we act in our bodies, the ways that we act in our spirits, right? And I think that's why yoga is so powerful for me, is that, you know, as someone who has been on a big journey in terms of coming to terms with my sexuality and gender, who's been on a big journey in terms of my own kind of struggles with mental illness, I think yoga is a place where I can just connect to my breath, my mind, my body, and my spirit, and just reclaim that energy in a way, and also kind of cultivate more of that relationship with myself that helps me to recognize that, you know, regardless of the ways that other people see me or, you know, project harm onto me, that I own my body, I own my spirit, and I own my own path to liberation as well. And I think everyone else does too, you know, in their,
Mm-hmm.
and that's like kind of the beauty of the individuality of the practice.
I love that. I was just reading the
Mhm.
captions for that part because I just really like um that part at the end of or I like the whole thing with the I own my body, I own my
Mhm.
spirituality, I own my see the captions are gone and I forgot the last part. Liberation.
Mhm. Mhm.
So good. Also thank you for the apology. You don't have to say you don't have to say sorry. It's okay. I was really lucky that I found out via that interaction, that like experience. I didn't go like viral, but it was still like a lot more negative comments than I've ever gotten. Um,
Wow.
but I was very lucky that there are some wonderful folks in my community who saw the comments, and were like, why don't you just turn your notifications off? We will deal with this. So I had a
Mhm.
couple people who were um like they checked in with me and said like they didn't just do it automatically. They said they checked in with me and were like, how are you feeling about this? Do you feel okay to handle it or delete things? Or would it be okay if I commented back? I have the space and the time today, and I would love to educate some of these folks if I can, which I found
Mhm.
very considerate and like it was very helpful. So in some cases, some of these friends did step in and comment back. And then there were some cases where I just deleted the comments because it was just like hating for the sake of hating.
Yeah.
Which reminds me, one of these friends, I'm not sure, I think you know them, Shannon
Mm-hmm.
Crow.
Mm-hmm.
She talked on her stories, and we did a podcast a while back. I have no idea how long ago. The concept of time lately has been a bit weird for me, but
All good.
um, someone had messaged them about how they said, oh, social justice work doesn't belong in the yoga studio or yoga spaces. I've had a few people, as I've been a little bit more vocal with what's happening in Palestine, who've done a similar
Mm-hmm.
thing with me. And I mean, I completely disagree because I think that's based off the assumption that yoga is only a physical practice, which it's not. I mean, I'm not telling you that, more people listening. Um,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but
totally.
would love, if you have any thoughts on that, would love to hear, because it's basically what you said a second ago, or I don't know if it was that then or a couple of the
Mm-hmm.
time before that, but you said something that was very like so close to um answering this that I just thought I
No,
would.
it's so good. Yeah, thank you so much for speaking to that. I'm again like glad that you had community who stepped in and was willing to do that hard work of helping people unlearn, and that you had support through that experience. I think when it comes to talking about social justice work and yoga, I think I'll start off by saying that, especially in the West, we have this notion that our spirits are separate from our bodies and that our individual bodies and beings are separate from one another. Like we've kind of lost this sense of community in a lot of ways, and of that holistic nature, of being human, you know? And I just feel like for me, with the way that I've been able to come to know the practice, like yoga in Sanskrit, the word yog like means union, oneness, connection, right? Um, and so I think that something that I've noticed as I practice more is that I'm inherently starting to see the way that all of these things are connected. That, for example, like the body that you have, your ability to do certain yoga postures to begin with, your ability to like go to a studio or a class, these are all tied to your social location, to your position in the world, whether you're physically able, whether you have the economic ability to transport yourself to a studio, whether that studio is a welcoming place for you. And so I think that you know unfortunately, because of the world that we live in and like this late stage capitalist economy that controls how we access things, you know any kind of like spiritual practice, physical practice is also tied to social justice and to politics in a lot of ways. Um, and I also think that, you know, maybe there's people out there who are listening who they just want to go into the studio, they want to turn their brain off for an hour and come out feeling more relaxed, feeling more energized in their bodies. And they don't want the discomfort of having to navigate, the social justice aspects of yoga that are being talked about more. But I think that again, it's important that we come back to that sense of connectedness and that sense of perhaps viewing the world in a way that's more holistic to how for example, every way that we access yoga and interact with yoga is connected to those broader kind of identity things. And I think it also comes back to privilege. I always think about this with social justice work, is it's like the people with privilege are usually the ones who can say no to these conversations, and
Mm,
the people who are in minority groups or who have struggled for their rights to even have these conversations, are the ones who are saying, just please listen, hold dialogue, hold
absolutely.
space for us too. And um, so I think that, for people who are maybe approaching it from this lens of like not wanting to deal with social justice, that is an inherent privilege to be able to say no to that. Because like you said, for that one student who maybe spoke to you about how hearing the term namaste in class made them feel really uncomfortable, or maybe some of the experiences I've shared earlier on about going to studios that were white dominated spaces, and how it was uncomfortable to, see these traditions that I'd grown up with being used in such a different context. I think that there needs to be perhaps a bit of a questioning of, like, if you're engaging with the practice in a certain way, why are you okay with someone else being uncomfortable with that,
Ooh, that's such a good question.
right? Like, if you're like, I get it from an individual level. If you're kind of just focused on yourself, maybe you're like, I just don't want to have to deal with this. But then if you're really thinking about yoga as a practice that we do in community with other people, then, to me, it's like, how can you accept that someone else would come in and feel uncomfortable in a space that's supposed to be about, you know, accepting your body and connecting with it and connecting with your spirit, you know?
Yeah.
So that's my little take on that. I kind of went on a bunch of tangents there, but I hope
It
that
was
kind of
perfect. It's perfect. Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, that part none of it was didn't feel tangential. I don't think I know how to say that word. Shouldn't have tried.
Okay.
None of it felt like that to me. None of it felt
Mhm.
like tangents to me. Wow, I love this conversation. I feel like I've done this a couple times now where I've asked this while recording the podcast, which is like an interesting approach. I don't mean to put you on the
Mhm.
spot. I mean, I can
That's
edit this
okay.
out. Would you ever want to come back to do another episode?
I would love to. Yes,
Okay,
100%.
perfect. Because I feel like there's a lot of parts of this that we could go into even more.
Hmm.
And we're already close to an hour long episode. But
Yeah, for sure.
I would love to know, I would love to continue some of this. So if
Hmm.
you're happy to come back, then I would love that. Um, is there anything else that you want to share? Like, I'll ask for you to plug your stuff in a second, but is there anything else
Hmm.
that you want to share or that you wish more people knew or anything you want to say, like just before we kind of wrap up a little?
Yeah, I definitely think again, I've been so inspired by like the online community and the ongoing conversations around this. So I already shouted out Tejal Yoga, Susanna Barkataki, another amazing human being who's doing a lot of work in terms of yoga and accessibility is Jivana Heyman. And so yeah, just taking the time for folks to follow those creators. The Tejal Yoga has a podcast called the Yoga is Dead podcast. It's amazing if you want
Love
to
that
kind of learn more
podcast.
about the industry. So yeah, just plugging those resources for folks who want to maybe learn more about these conversations.
Cool. I will put all of those in the comments, or not the
Mhm.
comments, the show notes. Um,
Mhm.
I wrote them down so that if you're listening when you're driving or whatever, don't panic. It's all below. You can just click from
Mhm.
there. Or on my website on the actual podcast episode page. I'll put them there too. So don't panic. We'll get those. Yoga is Dead podcast. The Yoga is Dead podcast is amazing. I
Mhm.
love that. I love that podcast a lot. Um,
Mhm.
thank you for sharing those. I appreciate it. Um,
Mhm.
where can folks find you?
So I am at Shanti Yoga Collective on Instagram. I also have a Facebook page and a LinkedIn page at Shanti Yoga Collective. And I also have a podcast where I talk about these kinds of things as well as do some guided meditations. And that's the Find Your Shanti podcast on Spotify. And I guess for folks who don't know, Shanti is spelled Shanti, and it means peace roughly in English. So yeah, that's kind of where you can find me.
Awesome. And you teach online and in person, right?
Yeah, so I love doing online private sessions, online group classes. And I'm pretty nomadic, so yeah, anywhere around the Ontario area, or if you're interested in kind of having me come do stuff elsewhere, you can always get in touch and I'd be happy to make some magic happen.
Cool. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your time and your energy and your knowledge, and other things that I just lost the words for. Thank you for sharing your space.
Of course.
Um,
Thank you for holding space and for
ah,
welcoming me. Really appreciate it.
yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm excited for the continuing of this conversation.
Hmm.
Um, I will talk to you soon.
All right. Talk to you soon.
I adored this conversation and I'm so glad to have had it. I'm really excited for more episodes with Sneha. If you didn't catch the resources that she shared, it will be in the I keep wanting to say captions, the show notes. You can go down there, check the show notes. You'll see all the resources that she shared, as well as her information, so you can go and support her directly. If you have any questions, you can either use Spotify has this thing where you scroll down and there's like it says, "What did you think of this episode?" You can use that little box and send in your thoughts, send in your questions, or you can send them directly to me, info@movewithbillie.com, Billie. If it is something that you would like to be talked about or touched on in the next episode, if you want it to be anonymous, it can be anonymous too. That's totally fine. Let me know. We can always bring it up in the next episode. If you have any feedback, any comments, anything like that, send them the same way. You can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Move with Billie. Again, that's with an IE, not a Y. And then more than anything else, if you again subscribe to my newsletter, then you can hear from me more often. So thanks for listening. Please go follow Sneha, go follow all the stuff that she is offering. And I hope you have a fantastic week. I will talk to you soon. Bye.